At 2:17 a.m., the little porch light on Kynaston Road still burned, steady, warm, ordinary, while inside the house, Professor Peter Farquhar's mind quietly came apart. Peter had spent his life in rooms that smelled of paper and polish. Lecture halls, libraries, staff offices with humming radiators and dusty windows. He was the kind of man students remembered years later: calm voice, careful jokes, a habit of pausing before a sentence as if he respected every word. In retirement, that gentleness remained, along with a loneliness he didn't like to admit. His home was neat in the way of someone who lived alone and wanted proof of order. Books lined the walls in disciplined rows. Mugs hung from hooks, all facing forward. A chess set sat on a side table, pieces arranged for a game that never quite began. Then the lapses started. First, small humiliations: misplaced keys, a kettle left on too long, a burner turned the wrong way. He blamed age, stress, one of those days. But soon it became harder to laugh off. He woke with bruises he couldn't explain. He found wet towels in odd places. He forgot the names of colleagues he'd known for decades. The world around him began to feel slightly tilted, like a picture frame hung crooked. Doctors ran test after test. Peter sat under clinical lights while strangers asked him to count backwards and remember lists of words. He tried to be charming about it, but the fear lived underneath, the terror of losing himself, one sentence at a time. And as that fear grew, so did the drinking. A glass of whiskey became a nightly companion. Then it became a crutch. Then it became, in his own mind, a kind of medicine, something that warmed the cold edge of panic and made the house feel less empty. That was when Benjamin Field appeared. Benjamin was young enough to be Peter's son, with a soft voice and an attentive gaze that made people feel, instantly, heard. He spoke about faith in a way that sounded tender rather than strict. He could discuss literature without showing off. He knew when to touch someone's arm lightly, when to nod, when to lean closer like a secret was being shared. To Peter, it felt like a miracle, companionship arriving exactly when he needed it. Benjamin began to visit more often. He brought food. He helped with small household tasks. He asked Peter about his books, his students, his memories. He prayed with him, quietly, respectfully, hands folded, head bowed, a solemn kindness that made Peter's throat tighten. Soon, Benjamin wasn't just a visitor. He was a presence. He suggested herbal teas for sleep. He poured drinks with an almost ceremonial care. He reminded Peter to take something to settle the nerves, always said gently, always with concern. And when Peter stumbled in conversation, when he forgot a detail he'd known for years, Benjamin's face softened into sympathy, as if he'd been expecting it, prepared for it. Peter started apologizing. For being forgetful. For being a burden. For needing help. Benjamin told him not to apologize. Outside the house, people noticed changes. Friends heard Peter repeat stories, lose track of dates, drift into confusion mid-sentence. A neighbor saw him staring at his own front gate as if unsure whether it belonged to him. Even in public, his hand sometimes trembled around his cup. And in private, the house grew quieter. One evening, Peter sat at his desk with a pen hovering over paper, trying to write a simple note and finding that the words would not line up. The clock ticked. The radiator clicked. Somewhere down the hall, a floorboard creaked, soft, measured footsteps. Benjamin appeared in the doorway with a small smile and a glass that caught the lamplight. "Drink this," he said, voice low and steady. "It'll help you rest." Peter looked at the glass. Then at Benjamin's face, so calm, so caring. He took it. And in the dim hush of the house, with the porch light still shining like nothing was wrong, the first real step of Benjamin's plan quietly clicked into place. The changes came in waves, not all at once. Peter would wake in the morning feeling as though his thoughts were wrapped in cotton. Sounds arrived a second too late. Light felt harsh. His mouth tasted faintly bitter, even before the whiskey. Benjamin explained it away with gentle certainty: poor sleep, stress, the weight of aging. He spoke as if these things were already decided facts, not questions. "You're being very brave," Benjamin would say, squeezing Peter's hand. "Not everyone faces this with such grace." Peter clung to those words. Benjamin began keeping notes. At first, Peter thought it was thoughtful: dates of doctor's appointments, reminders about medication, lists of groceries. But the notes multiplied. Times. Dosages. Observations about Peter's mood, his memory, how much he drank, how quickly he tired. Benjamin framed it as care, as responsibility. Peter felt oddly relieved not to be in charge of himself anymore. The accidents increased. Peter slipped in the bathroom and cracked his elbow on the sink. Another day, he nearly fell down the stairs, saved only by Benjamin's quick grip on his arm. Once, he found a chair overturned in the study and couldn't remember moving it. Benjamin listened closely, brow furrowed, then nodded slowly. "This is exactly what we were worried about," he said. The doctors noticed too. Peter's test results were confusing, sometimes normal, sometimes alarming. One specialist suggested early cognitive decline. Another couldn't explain the sudden drops and recoveries. Peter watched their faces tighten as they spoke to him carefully, as if he might shatter. Benjamin always sat beside him, hand resting on Peter's knee. At home, Benjamin encouraged prayer when Peter became frightened. He spoke about surrender, about trust, about accepting help from those God placed in one's path. Peter, raised on faith but long distant from it, felt himself pulled back by the comfort of certainty. When Benjamin said, "God is watching over you," Peter wanted desperately to believe it was true. The drinks became stronger. Benjamin poured them generously, topping off glasses before Peter realized they were empty. Sometimes, Benjamin added something else, colorless, tasteless, while talking, while laughing softly, while Peter's attention drifted. It happened in plain sight, disguised by routine and trust. Soon, Peter could barely follow conversations by evening. His words slurred. His thoughts tangled. He grew embarrassed, apologetic. He started canceling visits from colleagues, claiming he wasn't feeling well. Benjamin encouraged it. "You don't need their judgment," he said. "You need peace." And peace, Benjamin insisted, required preparation. One afternoon, Benjamin raised the subject of paperwork. Wills. Arrangements. "Just in case," he said, voice gentle, almost reluctant. Peter resisted at first. It felt like admitting defeat. But Benjamin framed it as responsibility, as kindness to those left behind. "You deserve to decide things while you still can," he said softly. Peter stared at the documents, the letters swimming slightly on the page. Benjamin guided his hand, explaining each section patiently, praising him when he nodded along. The changes felt small in the moment. Logical. Reasonable. Benjamin was, after all, the one person who never left. As weeks passed, Peter's world shrank to the house, the drinks, and Benjamin's voice. The porch light still burned each night. Neighbors saw Benjamin come and go, always polite, always attentive. Inside, the books gathered dust. The chessboard remained untouched. Peter began sleeping longer, waking later, losing track of days entirely. Sometimes, he would look at Benjamin with sudden confusion, as if trying to remember when he'd arrived. Benjamin always smiled. "Don't worry," he said. "I'm here." And Peter, exhausted and afraid, believed him. By the time winter settled in, Peter Farquhar no longer trusted his own senses. Some mornings, he woke convinced someone had been moving through the house at night. Other days, he felt certain he'd spoken to friends who insisted they hadn't heard from him in weeks. Time stretched and folded in on itself, hours slipping away without memory or meaning. Benjamin explained it all with calm authority. "It's part of the process," he said. "Your mind is tired." Peter began to write notes to himself, simple reminders taped to cupboards and doors. "Turn off the stove. Lock the front door. Benjamin knows what to do." The last one appeared in Benjamin's handwriting, though Peter didn't remember when it had been added. The drinks now arrived without asking. Benjamin would press the glass into Peter's hand, watching closely as he swallowed. Some evenings, Peter felt strange almost immediately, his limbs heavy, his thoughts drifting far from his body. The room would tilt slightly, as if floating. Benjamin would guide him to bed, speaking softly, reassuringly. "You're safe," he whispered. "Just rest." Behind that gentleness, Benjamin was documenting everything. Notebooks hidden in drawers. Audio recordings stored carefully. Photographs of documents, signatures, moments of weakness. He recorded Peter's confusion, his reliance, his increasing isolation. Not as memories, but as evidence of progress. Peter's will was changed again. Then adjusted once more. Benjamin framed each revision as necessary, as protection against distant relatives who wouldn't understand Peter's wishes. Peter's signature grew shakier each time. His consent came slower. But Benjamin never rushed him. He waited. He smiled. He prayed. On the night it ended, the house was unusually quiet. Rain tapped against the windows in a steady rhythm. The porch light glowed through the darkness, casting a familiar pool of yellow on the wet pavement outside. Inside, Peter sat in his armchair, wrapped in a blanket, glass in hand. His eyes were unfocused, his breathing slow. Benjamin sat nearby, watching. Peter tried to speak, something about a memory, a lecture he used to give, but the words wouldn't come together. He frowned, frustrated, then slumped back. The glass tipped slightly, amber liquid spilling onto the carpet. Benjamin didn't move to stop it. Hours later, when the house had gone completely still, Benjamin made the call. The scene looked simple. Too simple. An elderly man. Alcohol. An unfortunate accident. The professionals who arrived noted the bottle, the empty glass, the quiet order of the home. Nothing appeared disturbed. Nothing demanded suspicion. Benjamin stood nearby, eyes red, voice trembling as he spoke about Peter's struggles, his fear of losing his mind, his reliance on drink. It all sounded tragically plausible. The conclusion came quickly. Peter Farquhar was laid to rest as a man overtaken by age, confusion, and loneliness. His colleagues mourned him quietly. His neighbors shook their heads sadly. Another private tragedy, neatly explained. Benjamin inherited what had been arranged. For a brief moment, he stepped back, grieved publicly, spoke reverently of Peter's brilliance and kindness. He attended services. He thanked people for their sympathy. He played the role perfectly. But the notebooks didn't close. Within weeks, Benjamin's attention shifted outward, toward the houses nearby. Toward another quiet life. Another door that opened too easily to kindness, faith, and trust. Across the street lived an elderly woman named Martin. She noticed Benjamin first because he seemed so helpful. So devoted. So familiar with loss. And as Benjamin crossed the road for the first time, offering a warm smile and a gentle introduction, the pattern, carefully practiced, meticulously refined, began all over again. And Martin had lived on that street for decades, long enough to watch neighbors age, move away, or disappear entirely. She was warm, deeply religious, and generous to a fault, someone who believed that kindness was a duty, not a choice. Loneliness had settled into her life quietly, after the loss of her husband, after friends drifted into their own worlds. Benjamin sensed it immediately. He approached in the way he always did, without urgency, without demand. A friendly conversation at the gate. An offer to help carry groceries. A shared moment of prayer when she mentioned her faith. He spoke warmly of Peter, presenting himself as a devoted companion still healing from loss. And listened. Benjamin began visiting regularly. He admired her home, asked about her memories, praised her devotion. He framed their connection as something meaningful, two souls brought together by purpose. And felt chosen, useful again. She trusted him. Soon, Benjamin started speaking about signs. About messages. About God's will. He claimed to receive guidance during prayer, feelings, impressions, sometimes written notes he said came to him in moments of clarity. He told Anne that she had a special role to play, that her generosity was not just admirable, but required. When she hesitated, Benjamin reminded her that doubt was natural, but disobedience, he suggested gently, carried consequences. Money became part of the conversation gradually. Small amounts at first. Help with expenses. Contributions to causes Benjamin said were divinely inspired. Each request was wrapped in reassurance and gratitude. And wanted to please him. She wanted to do what was right. Benjamin isolated her carefully. He questioned her relatives' intentions, suggesting they didn't respect her faith or understand her calling. He encouraged secrecy, presenting it as protection from interference. And began to pull away from those who asked too many questions. But unlike Peter, Anne noticed something didn't sit right. The messages from God felt rehearsed. Too specific. Too convenient. And when Benjamin pressured her about transferring property, about changing arrangements, fear crept in where certainty used to live. And confided in a relative, quietly, hesitantly, sharing the notes, the requests, the pressure. The relative listened, alarm growing with every word. Authorities were contacted. What followed was slow and deliberate. Investigators didn't rush. They listened. They observed. And then they began to look backward. They noticed the similarities. The sudden involvement. The religious framing. The financial changes. The isolation. And most disturbingly, the earlier death across the street that had once seemed so tragically simple. Benjamin's private world unraveled quickly once examined. Notebooks were discovered. Recordings. Photographs. Detailed plans written in calm, methodical language, outlining trust, influence, timing. Notes about substances. About control. About outcomes. Peter Farquhar's passing was re-examined. A second post-mortem told a different story, one that didn't align with accident or confusion. The narrative that had once seemed so neat began to fracture under scrutiny. Benjamin was arrested quietly. The man who had spoken so softly, prayed so earnestly, now sat in silence as the evidence stacked higher and higher. The charm that once opened doors could no longer close the distance between truth and consequence. For Anne, there was relief, mixed with guilt and disbelief. For Peter, there was finally a voice speaking on his behalf. And for Benjamin Field, the careful illusion he'd built, one glass, one prayer, one signature at a time, collapsed completely under the weight of what he'd left behind. The courtroom was quiet in the way only courtrooms can be, controlled, restrained, heavy with expectation. Benjamin Field sat at the defense table in a pressed suit, hands folded neatly, eyes lowered. To anyone who hadn't followed the case, he might have looked like a man overwhelmed by circumstance rather than one at the center of it. But the evidence told a different story, and it told it relentlessly. Prosecutors laid out the pattern piece by piece. They spoke of how Benjamin selected his targets, older, kind, intellectually curious, spiritually open. How he embedded himself slowly, never forcing trust, always earning it. How he used faith as a shield and affection as leverage. Witnesses described his calm presence, his careful words, his ability to make people feel chosen. Then the records were introduced. Notebooks filled with observations. Timelines. Handwritten plans that spoke of influence, control, and eventual reward. Audio recordings captured private moments, confusion, dependence, vulnerability. Photographs documented signatures, documents, changes that had once seemed ordinary. Medical experts explained the substances found later, how they affected memory, balance, judgment. How, combined with alcohol, they could quietly dismantle a person's sense of reality. How the symptoms could mimic decline, masking deliberate interference beneath a familiar narrative of aging. The re-examination of Peter Farquhar's passing became the emotional center of the trial. Friends and colleagues testified about Peter's intellect, his independence, the sharp contrast between who he had been and who he became in his final months. The jury listened as the careful image of an unfortunate accident dissolved into something far more calculated. Benjamin's defense argued affection, care, tragic coincidence. But the diaries betrayed him. They showed intention where he claimed love, planning where he claimed concern. And perhaps most damaging of all, they showed repetition, proof that Peter was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a design. When Anne Montmartin took the stand, her voice trembled, but she did not falter. She spoke of prayer sessions that felt staged, of pressure masked as devotion, of fear dressed up as faith. She spoke of how close she came to losing everything, not just money, but her sense of self. The jury watched Benjamin as she spoke. He did not look at her. The verdict came after long deliberation. Guilty. The word landed without drama, but with finality. Benjamin showed little reaction, no outburst, no visible collapse. Just a slow blink, as if acknowledging a result he had always known was possible. The sentence was severe. Life. No quiet exit. No second chance to charm his way into another living room, another lonely heart. In the gallery, there was no celebration. Only exhalation. For Peter Farquhar, justice arrived too late, but it arrived nonetheless. His story, once dismissed as a sad accident, had been rewritten in truth. And as Benjamin was led away, the calm expression he'd perfected over years of deception finally failed him, if only for a moment. Because for the first time, he had no one left to convince. After the verdict, the house on Kynaston Road fell silent in a way it never had before. The porch light was finally turned off. Peter Farquhar's home was emptied slowly, carefully. Colleagues helped sort through books and papers, pausing often, as if expecting his voice to drift in from another room. Marginal notes in the books revealed the man he had been, curious, sharp, generous with his thoughts until the very end. The signs of confusion that once defined his final months now read differently, reinterpreted through the lens of what had been done to him. For those who loved him, grief shifted shape. It was no longer mixed with doubt or quiet embarrassment about his decline. It became grief with clarity, anger, sadness, and a fierce determination that his story would not be misunderstood again. And Montmartin returned to a quieter life. Trust came slowly after what she'd endured. She spoke openly about manipulation, about how easily kindness and faith could be turned against someone. Her willingness to speak became a warning to others, and in that, she found a sense of purpose she thought she'd lost. As the case spread beyond the courtroom, the public struggled with the same question again and again: how could no one have seen it sooner? The answer was uncomfortable. Because the danger had not arrived loudly. It had come with prayers, with patience, with soft-spoken care. It had worn the face of compassion and borrowed the language of love. And by the time the truth emerged, the damage was already done. In prison, Benjamin Field faded from public view. No audience. No one left to impress. The notebooks that once documented control and confidence became artifacts of exposure rather than power. The carefully constructed persona, the gentle believer, the devoted companion, could not survive without someone to perform it for. What remained was the record. A reminder that manipulation does not always look cruel. That harm can arrive quietly. That intelligence, kindness, and faith can be exploited by those who understand them too well. Peter Farquhar was remembered not for the way his life ended, but for the way it was taken, piece by piece, trust by trust, and for the truth that eventually restored his voice. And in the end, that truth carried further than deception ever could. Because some lights, once turned back on, reveal everything that was hiding in the dark.